Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Shifley Lectures after almost a year of absence. We're back with a great historian, writer, researcher, and a very good friend of mine, Dr. Jim Robbins. In fact, Jim taught me at the National Defense University after 9/11 in a couple of courses. Jim has written for the Washington Times, National Review. He's on the editorial writer for USA Today now. And some of his books, including Tet, I would toss out last in their class, Custer, Pickett, and the Goats of West Point as my favorite Jim Robbins book, and where he talks about all the goats of West Point and the incredible things they did in their careers. And I think I told Jim the story once, but in teaching naval history, and as I did when it came out when I was in poli-sci, I buy one copy of the book every semester and I give it to the midshipman who has the lowest grade in my class, just to say that there's some hope. So Jim, thanks. Looking forward to your talk, and unfortunately I have to leave a little early. But I should say that these lectures, the Shifley Lectures, named after Vice Admiral and Mrs. Ralph Shifley, veteran of World War II, and the class of 1950, and Captain Ross, we always appreciate the class's support for the museum. So thank you very much, sir. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Cliff. Appreciate it. Well, I'd like to add to the West Point thing that I also was a guest here a few years ago, which I did a lecture about the anchormen, the Naval Academy anchormen, and how they shared the same characteristics of the West Point goats, out-of-the-box thinkers who could get into trouble, but the real talent of both of these groups were they could get out of trouble. That's why they actually graduated, as opposed to getting kicked out. So that was a fun lecture, too. All right, so we're going to talk about the Tet Offensive. This is based on the book that I wrote of the same name, This Time We Win. You could say, why was that the title, This Time We Win? And the reason is that when I was doing research on this book, I would talk to a lot of Vietnam veterans and say, I'm doing work on the Tet Offensive. And more than once, I had a guy say to me, do we win this time? Well, because when they were there, they won it. So yes, this time we win. How Tet is remembered. If you came up with a one-sentence summary of the Tet Offensive, I think it would be this, that surprise attack by the North Vietnamese in VC on symbolic targets in which media reports turned the public against the war and drove Lyndon Johnson to the bargaining, finally drove Lyndon Johnson to the bargaining table. I would say that's a fair one-sentence summary of how the Tet Offensive is represented in most histories or most people you talk to, many educated people who know something about this. Tet stays in the news. You see references to it. Some of these are a little older headlines, but you still see them today. Almost anything that happens, some clever person will say, this is just like the Tet Offensive. Some car bomb goes off somewhere. Some guy shoots up some building. It's just like the Tet Offensive. And the reason that they do this is it's a very easy analytical lens for a reporter to establish a storyline. You see something bad happens, you say Tet Offensive, and suddenly everyone's thinking defeat, bad things happening, bad public opinion, and so forth. It was Joe Klein came here with his WikiLeaks, saying WikiLeaks is just like the Tet Offensive. Really? This is when they released a bunch of documents about the Afghan war. He said, oh yeah, because it's going to turn public opinion against the war. Well, A, the public had forgotten about Afghanistan by the time that came out, and B, nobody cared. So, it was just kind of absurd, but it shows how much of a reach these people will go to try to link everything to the Tet Offensive, drug cartels, what have you, Iran, everything else. So, why do that? Well, from the enemy point of view, this is great. It's inspirational to them. They look at the Tet Offensive as a model for this low-cost dramatic victory that they want, to generate press coverage and so forth. Because for the enemy, and you can see things written by Al-Qaeda people and others that look at Vietnam as the model. They say, we cannot defeat the Americans on the ground. They don't have the firepower to do it, but what they can do is target American public opinion. And so they see that as the locus of what they have to do in order to win their kind of wars. And an important thing to remember about people like this, or modern day insurgents, they don't want to stay insurgents or terrorists. They don't want to be terrorists. They're terrorists because they're weak, or they're insurgents because they're weak. They want to be strong. It's a basic Maoist model. You start off as a terrorist, you move up to your guerrilla insurgency, but the third stage of that is the conventional war, where you actually win. That's the winning part. So you're not a guerrilla because you want to be a guerrilla or you think that it's cool. You're a guerrilla because that's the best you can do. This is one of the problems, incidentally, that ISIS is facing right now. They kind of were going to that third stage, the conventional stage. They're like their convoys of tanks and all this other stuff. Well, the problem with that is that gives us nice targets. And when you go to that conventional stage, when you go from being an unconventional, irregular threat to being a conventional threat, that's where we excel. That's where we're really good at things. So ISIS's main problem right now is they were trying to do too much with that caliphate. Well, you build up your caliphate, run up your flag, have your headquarters and all this other stuff. You are establishing target groups for us to go get. So that's why they're losing right now, is they moved a little bit too far too fast. So good for them. But let me tell you something about that version of Tet, that one-sentence summary. It's all wrong. Every aspect of that is wrong. Tet was not a surprise attack. It was not aimed at symbolic targets. It did not increase anti-war sentiment in the US, and it did not drive Lyndon Johnson to the bargaining table. So I'm going to show you how all of those things are incorrect. Not a surprise attack. Our guys knew what was going to happen when Tet broke out at the end of January 1968. The enemy had been planning this attack since the previous summer. In the fall, orders started to go out to individual units. Units were getting in position to do what they needed to do. We started capturing those orders. We had the basic outline of the thing by November. We had it. We had captured that. In January of 1968, this is in the first week of January 68, at the US Embassy, there was a briefing about what we knew and the expected attack that was coming. Reporters, didn't really care about it. It got a few lines in a few papers. Actually, I found a commentary piece in a small town newspaper in South Carolina where a guy outlined exactly what the government thought was going to happen and then what he thought was going to happen, that it would take everybody by surprise and everyone would say it was a defeat. So some dude in rural South Carolina knew more than our best analysts, or our best reporters in the second week in January. I thought that was kind of interesting. We had, by January 8th, the traditional Tet truce, the New Year's truce, which the enemy had violated before, so it wasn't like a big information that they were going to violate it again, was cut back. Instead of 3 days, we got the South Vietnamese to cut it back to about 2 days. Ours was cut down to about half a day. But it was because of this, because we thought something was going to happen. We have Lieutenant General Frederick Wan, pictured here, one of Westmoreland's sub-commanders, commanded the forces around Saigon, an old South Asia hand. He knew things about the area in which he was operating. He had seen the intelligence. He was also an intelligence officer in World War II. And he looked at it and he said, you know what, things are going to happen. And he had orders to move his troops towards the border with Cambodia because there was some indication something might happen there. But he said, you know what, I think that's what they want us to think. I think it's going to happen in the cities, so I want to keep my guys around the cities. And Westmoreland said, okay, I trust you, you do that. And that's why we had forces on hand to counteract what was going to happen. Even by the middle part of January, we were capturing tactical plans in some of the areas around different cities where we could see exactly what they were going to do, down to the units. And then when they managed to finally attack, they did exactly what we thought. And so they were quickly defeated in those cases. The alert status, January 30th, because of some mistakes they made, some guys stepped off 2 days early. Some guys these are enemy attacked 2 days early, like at Da Nang. Some attacked 1 day early, and then some attacked on time. But by the time of the on time, we already knew. And so we were on full alert status when the Tet Offensive actually broke out. So this notion that it was a surprise attack, it's not quite correct. In fact, it's completely incorrect. But to whom was it a surprise? Well, it was a surprise to reporters. They were surprised. And by the way, not all reporters were surprised. It was mainly the producers and people in the US. Reporters on the ground, they knew something was going to go on too. You had reporters who were canceling their vacation plans because they wanted to be in country for when the thing happened. You had a reporter writing for the Washington Post a few days before this talking about the expected spring attack. So again, when you go back and say, oh, they took us completely by surprise, it wasn't strategic surprise, it wasn't operational surprise, it wasn't even tactical surprise. They had no surprise. If anything, they were the ones who were surprised that we were ready for them. So that was just something created by the media. Okay, Tet not aimed at symbolic targets. And I'm going to talk about the embassy attack in a minute. But the thing to know about Tet was the enemy was trying to win. They didn't do this attack to lose. They did it because they wanted to end the war. Why was that? One thing was Ho Chi Minh was pretty sick at this time. He was getting towards the end of his life. They wanted to end the war with a victory before he died. So there was this urgency to get it done. How were they going to get it done? 80,000 troops attacking in 100 cities. Okay, this isn't symbolic. The plan was they knew they couldn't engage the US Army, US Marines, Air Force, Navy directly, and Coast Guard, by the way. They couldn't beat us one-on-one. They knew that. The previous 3 years had shown that. So the plan was get us out of the cities, get us out into the countryside, have our main forces out of position, and then have an uprising in the cities. The cities would be captured, the people in South Vietnam would rise up to support them, and then it would be a fait accompli. They'd overthrow the government, and then US forces would be out in the hinterland somewhere, and we would have to give up because our rationale for being in the country wouldn't exist anymore, so then we would leave. That was the plan. Interesting plan. Various problems with that plan. The most important problem with that plan was the belief that the South Vietnamese people were going to rise up. That they had good information, that the people were so disgusted with their government that the communists would be welcome. And so when they came rolling into town, the South Vietnamese people would rise to support them. That was their whole plan hinged on that. Where did they get that information? The New York Times. They got that information from the American press. They figured they were mirror imaging their press. I mean, their press was tightly controlled. They figured our press wouldn't, if our press was reporting stuff that was so negative to the war effort, that it must be true. Well, not quite. Here's some scenes from various places. Marines at Hue City, the toughest fight of the entire Tet Offensive other than Khe Sanh, which I'll get to in a second. That's where the North Vietnamese held out for about 3 weeks. Their most successful of the attacks where they took over Hue. And as you know, when the population didn't rise to support them, they started killing them, massacred thousands of people and buried them in spots around the city that were then turning up for years afterwards. They probably still find them. Over on the other side, that's at Tan Son Nhut airfield, kind of a typical outcome of the Tet attacks, piles of VC bodies. I mean, none of their attacks really worked very well. They actually pierced the perimeter at Tan Son Nhut, which was one of their critical attack points because it was, as I said, Pentagon East. It's where all our important headquarters were. In fact, they took over what they thought was a headquarters, the headquarters. It was actually headquarters of Headquarters Company that they took over, but they misread the sign. They didn't know what Headquarters Company meant. So that's what they took over, thinking it was. At the tactical level, our guys fought brilliantly, and so did the South Vietnamese. They get they get kind of bad reputation. But in fact, the South Vietnamese did a great job in their areas of responsibility. And in a post-battle survey by General Abrams, he found that only 8 of 149 battalions performed below where they should have performed. Yet, Tet was called a symbolic victory, even though we won every aspect of that campaign. Why? Well, one reason was this, focusing on the US Embassy attack. US Embassy was attacked by 19 VC. They were a pickup group. These were not trained specialists because the enemy had not originally targeted the US Embassy. They didn't think that it was an important target. It had no military value, and they were mainly going after places that had significance militarily. They threw in the embassy attack later, so they put together 19 guys and told them to go at it. This is where we get into a problem. The symbolic nature of this. Because the orders for the 19 sappers who attacked this thing were hold the embassy and then wait for reinforcements. That was their order. They were all killed pretty quickly. The plan was so bad that when CIA analysts got hold of it, they looked at it and said, this couldn't be real. This can't be their real plan. Their real plan must have been the symbolic nature of the attack. It must have been. So the analysts were not going with the facts. They were going with what they thought was going on in the minds of the enemy. So a briefing paper was put together. This is within a day of the thing happening. It was then handed up to the White House. It made it into White House talking points. And then a day later, the President and the Secretary of Defense both put out this talking point about the symbolic attack. It was not invented by the press. It was a self-inflicted wound from the White House, from the CIA. So the government was the source of this story that it was all symbolic. It wasn't reporters who made that up. That was a fun thing to research, by the way, tracking down the exact chain of evidence of that thing, but I found it. So that's a problem. Here we have a headline. This kind of typifies the problem. Embassy held for hours. Okay, point one, they did not get in the embassy building, but it was reported that they got in the embassy building. Well, who reported that? Peter Arnett. How did he know? He thought he heard a guy say so. What was his source? He overheard a guy saying so. Didn't have an actual source. Okay, fine. These were reporters at the embassy, by the way, who could easily have walked in the door and talked to embassy people, but instead they reported that the building had been held. The building was not held, it wasn't taken. They were all killed in the courtyard like this guy. Okay, second problem, Kong suicide squad. What's the problem with that? Well, if you attack a place and all your guys get killed, and then you say, oh, it was a suicide squad, well, you've made your objective, right? You have reached your objective. Your suicide squad attacked and they were killed. No, this wasn't a suicide squad. Their orders were seize the building and wait for reinforcements. Well, they didn't seize the building. They were all killed. Well, it must have been a kamikaze attack then. That was the assumption. No, bad assumption. They weren't there to die. They were there to live. They were fighters who were trying to win their battle, but they lost. Yet, when you get a headline like this, it makes it look like the enemy actually achieved their objective, which they did not. So you get this highly negative press coming out during Tet of these, surprised journalists. You have Walter Cronkite. He kind of typified it, and what he said was his proudest moment. Before the Tet Offensive, over 78% of all editorial comments on the war were positive. After Tet, only 29% or so were positive. During Tet, 100% negative. The press, the editors, that level of people, not necessarily the reporters. The reporters weren't always the problem, except for Peter Arnett and others, I'm kidding. But, it was mainly at that upper level where the decisions were made, where what content was going to run. That's where the problem was. And then you have this mythology around Walter Cronkite being sort of the honest broker. He was in favor of the war before Tet, then he turned against it after the war. Well, he wasn't exactly in favor before. He was definitely against it later. But the thing about Walter Cronkite is if you look at his reporting on Tet and then his special that he did later, here he's in Hue City after the city had been pacified, he gets it all wrong. He just gets things wrong, if you really look at it. He said that after this, the war will be conventional forces moving towards a decision and stuff like that. No, the enemy was destroyed. There was going to be a conventional war in Vietnam, and if there had been, we'd have won it. That actually would have been a good thing. But in any case, so you get this story that Lyndon Johnson watched the special and said to his aides, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America, and that was the so-called Walter Cronkite moment. And you still see people referring to the Walter Cronkite moment, the time when an honest broker changes the conscience of a nation. We were doing one thing, now we're going to do another thing, and the president shifts his policy dramatically, or something like that. Throughout the Iraq War, you would see this report, people waiting for the Walter Cronkite moment. Also in Afghanistan, wherever we are, everyone's waiting for the Walter Cronkite moment. Well, it was kind of a myth. In fact, Lyndon Johnson's approval ratings weren't great even before Tet. They weren't great after Tet, but it wasn't like this great plummet in his approval. People say, oh, after Tet he had like 60% disapproval. Well, before it was 54, so it wasn't, it wasn't like this one moment changed everything for Lyndon Johnson. But this notion of the Walter Cronkite moment has been inspiring journalists ever since to go out and kind of find this thing if they want to. Here's some stuff from Khe Sanh. An integral part of the Tet Offensive, it was, in the north, it was where they were trying to draw our attention away from the attacks in the south. And because it was a defensive battle, we were dug in on the hilltops. These were the kind of images that people saw. It wasn't, Marines charging out of their positions, taking on the enemy, like General Lowndes wanted to do. He said he'd much rather be out there attacking, but his mission was to defend Khe Sanh. So it became presented like that, as, oh, we're getting bombed every day, and what are we doing? Well, you don't see Operation Niagara going on over the next hill where divisions of the enemy are being decimated by B-52s. You don't quite see that on the camera. What you see is this kind of stuff. So it shaped the reporting. Or he had a statement from Walter Cronkite. He said, I found very few people out there who really believe Khe Sanh could be held if the North Vietnamese are determined to take it. Well, they had like 5 divisions surrounding a Marine regiment. I think they were determined to take it. They just couldn't take it. But when you say something like this, they could take it if they want it. How are you supposed to deal with a statement like that from a reporter? They could take it if they want it, meaning either A, you defeated them, which was true, or B, oh, they just didn't want it bad enough. Well, yeah, you guys, they didn't want to defeat you. They could have defeated you, they just chose not to. Really? Because is that why they were fighting and losing all those guys? But it's a great example of defining a battle in a way that favors the enemy, because there's really no coming back from a statement like that. It makes meaningful victory impossible. If we win, it's because they didn't want to beat us. Well, what kind of sense does that make? And here's another important image from the war of General Loan, who was the head of security in Saigon, shooting a prisoner. His name was Balam, who was a very bad guy. This is a very bad guy. And you don't see a lot of context in that photo. But Balam, who was one of the VC attackers, was found with some police he had just executed, along with some other guys who got killed. VC that got killed, but he survived, and they brought him in. And General Loan, who had just moments before seen his guys laying in a ditch, tied up and shot, was a little upset. That's how this went down. Loan was actually a pretty good guy, and Balam was a very bad guy. But in this instant, you see those roles. One's the executioner, the other guy is the bound prisoner. Now, is that a violation of the laws of war? It may be. We were in conditions of martial law. It was also the heat of battle. What can you say? The photographer who took this shot, Eddie Adams, it was one of those things like Rosenthal and Mount Suribachi, just like raised his camera and took it and just got the shot. Pulitzer Prize for spot photography. After this all went down, he started covering Luan because he was a reporter, not just a photographer, and he found him to be a really great guy. And in fact, over time, he determined that Luan was really in the right in this whole thing, and that the operative question is, what would you do in that situation? And it's a very good question, because a lot of people can make a moral judgment about that picture, but you have to put yourself in their shoes. And oh, by the way, there was a documentary made recently about this incident, about this photo from Eddie Adams' perspective, in which I got to participate. And at a roundtable that we had in New York, there was a guy in the audience who went on and on about how evil and what a war criminal Luan was and so forth. I said, wow, if you don't like that guy, you must really be mad at the Navy SEALs who killed Osama bin Laden. You know, shot down some old man in his home, right? Just burst in his home and killed him, right? I mean, if we want to start making these moral frameworks, let's talk about that. Yeah, that's okay.
I teach in history department. I teach midshipmen.
Yes.
I think these are specious comparisons. It's one thing to place a revolver next to a man who has his hands tied behind his back and shoot him in the street. It's another thing what the SEALs did at Osama bin Laden's compound, with people shooting in stairways and in the dark, is entirely another.
Oh, are you saying there were armed people that were shooting at our SEALs from the second floor of that hooch when bin Laden came out of his room in his underwear?
Yes, there were. There were people, his son-in-law was there, and his people were shooting.
There's shooting going on here too, by the way.
Yeah, he has his hands bound, and already, even by your argument here, Saigon is largely under control when they captured him. I think he's actually worse than you're saying. He didn't just kill policemen. I think he was responsible for killing policemen's families at a barracks as well. But I think
Case in point, my friend,
well,
right there. That's the next point I'm about to make.
I think there's a danger of saying that all of these examples can be conflated and laid over each other. I had in my mind, though, with Osama bin Laden, we were actually shooting at our SEALs when they shot back. I think the argument is,
If only they would release the footage.
yeah, I think the argument
I'd be thrilled if they would release the footage from a law of war standpoint. It would be interesting to see exactly what went down.
But they haven't been captured. But please go ahead.
Okay, well, yeah, let's expand on it. The other photo that ran on the front page of the New York Times of this South Vietnamese soldier who went home and found his family dead, killed by, it could have been his team. It's unclear, but they're in the same area. And here he is carrying his daughter. Did not win a Pulitzer Prize for spot photography, but it encapsulates the problem and the ambiguities of applying our neat frameworks for law of war to these situations. And regardless of how you come down ultimately on the question of what would you do if you're in General Luan's position, the fact is that became a symbol for the anti-war people to then indict our entire war effort, that who are these people we're defending? It was immediately taken up. Robert Kennedy did a speech a week later. He was preparing to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the presidency and talked about this and said, it was this great immoral act. And the interesting thing is, the further you got from it, the less context was given to it. In the initial reports when this was run, and there was also a film by ABC News, the videographer who took it actually lives in Annapolis. They heavily contextualized what was going on, what you're about to see, and so forth. But as you went on with reporting, and then when this photo was taken up by people who wanted to use it for their own purposes, all of the context was lost, and it was just brutal General Luan shoots an innocent person who was found on the streets of Saigon. They almost stripped away the fact that he was a VC. So it was interesting how that evolved. But yes, Eddie Adams later defended General Luan. In fact, when he was brought to the United States later, he was wounded in Little Tet, and then he lost his command and but he stayed in Vietnam trying to help his country out, South Vietnam. He fled here with nothing. In fact, he was given 5 minutes to fill a suitcase with whatever he had. He had no money. He wasn't one of those bag full of gold guys. He ran a pizza restaurant in Northern Virginia. But when the INS wanted to deport him because some members of Congress were upset that he was in the United States, they approached Eddie Adams, who took the photo, to say, hey, we want you to testify against General Lewan. He said, I'll testify in favor of General Lewan, because he thought that what he did was completely understandable, even if it wasn't something he himself might have done. And when General Lewan died later of cancer in the 1990s, Eddie Adams wrote his obituary in Time magazine. So, now this is the kind of image that people have accepted as indicative of public opinion, or of a majority stance of the public at the time, that somehow Tet encouraged people to oppose the war. And popular culture since 1968 has generally accepted and transmitted the notion that by this time most people opposed the war effort, and that the doves essentially had come into their own and the hawks were on the outs. In fact, if you look at polling, and unfortunately back then there weren't as many polls, but luckily there were some polls at key times that were useful. After Tet broke out, the number of people who self-identified as hawks actually went up. The number of people who were doves went down from right before Tet to sort of the week after Tet. In fact, I thought this was a really funny statistic. You had 25% of Americans saying, nuke 'em, essentially, so nuclear hawks. Even with the 60% of people who identified themselves as hawks, and that's a guess from the New York Times, 25% were willing to say nuke 'em. Yes, sir. Oh, okay, I'll hurry it up. Whereas the number who wanted to just pull out at the time, like unilaterally leave, was like 12%. Anyway, an interesting thing, but the point of this is that it wasn't that suddenly the anti-war movement flourished and so we had to leave, or make Tet into a defeat. That wasn't what happened. And here's the final point about driving Johnson to the bargaining table. He always wanted to go to the bargaining table. It wasn't his problem, it was the enemy's problem. They wouldn't bargain. He kept trying to bargain, 70 peace initiatives. Everyone they said no to. So it wasn't that suddenly, he lost Middle America, he had to go to the bargaining table. The thing was that he gave up. We could have escalated after Tet, and there were plans to do that from Westmoreland and others, to use Tet and our defeat of the enemy as an opportunity to just go for a final victory, invade the North, or have some kind of better presence in the North, and push for a victory. Increase the number of troops, go for it. Johnson said no. What he did instead was he needed to convince the enemy of his sincerity. That's what he told his special advisor, John Roach, who was a friend of mine, that he had to convince them I'm sincere. They don't think I'm sincere. I'm going to convince them I'm not going to run for office. And so he gave up running for the presidency. Hanoi agreed to the talks. Maybe it worked. He was sincere. Were they sincere? No, because of the day before the talks, they launched another offensive, the Little Tet Offensive. And that led to the Paris peace talks. So, lessons learned. What do we get from Tet? Don't give them credit for having a better plan than they think. Maybe their plan is crazy. Don't just assume that their plan, today we have this, the terrorists are adaptive and they're agile and all this other stuff. You know what? They also make mistakes. Don't define their objectives down to a point where they win, like that Suicide Squad. No. Don't give them credit for that. Don't think that everything that the terrorists doing is part of this great master plan, that everything they do is a win, because it isn't. The press coverage, I've written a lot about this. We can maybe talk about it in Q&A, but it's extremely difficult to have good storylines in unconventional wars. Unconventional wars, where you have lines on maps moving and capitals to conquer and things like that, it's easier. Unconventional wars, it's always you're taking the same hill. It's just tough to do. Public opinion doesn't shift as quickly or in ways that people always think it will. Another important point. And incidentally, let me just say that in 2007, when George Bush was contemplating the surge strategy, his approval rating was much lower than anything that LBJ had, but he still went ahead and did it. And that temporarily won us that war. And exploit opportunities. That wasn't going to happen in Vietnam because Johnson had already delimited that war, but it's important to be able to change your plans. And strong leadership, which we did not have. And it was, if you're looking at the Tet Offensive, most people blame the media, those who see blame in it. I tend to blame Lyndon Johnson more than I blame the press. I think the press followed where Johnson led, and if he had been a stronger leader, that we'd have a different story. Anyway, with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
I recall from that time that one reason Tet had such an enormous public reaction is because in 1967, Westmoreland had come back to the U.S. and did this college tour where he assured all of these college kids who were very much starting to wonder what we were doing there, that D.C. were on the rocks, that they couldn't keep taking the pounding we were going to give them, and this was all going to be over
That's
pretty
right.
soon. And then this blew up in their faces.
Absolutely right. In August of 1967, Lyndon Johnson said, we're going to have a good news campaign because not enough people like what we're doing in Vietnam. In fact, the lowest public approval of the entire war was August of 67, and before Tet. So Johnson said, we're going to get the good news out. And so it wasn't just Westmoreland, it was everybody in the whole administration. They were out there giving speeches, talking, we're winning, everything is, going great. And yeah, they kind of set that up. Now, honest journalists would note that there are always caveats. So, well, there could be suicide attacks, there could be other things happening. But yeah, they kind of set the stage for that with the Good News campaign. Nothing in the Good News campaign was a lie, but the way they made it sound, it was almost as though, it was won. Now you could say, well, the enemy also thought the same thing, that the Americans were winning and they had to do this dramatic thing to win. And because Tet was a victory for us militarily, you could say, well, that confirmed the point, that the enemy couldn't really do anything. They had this last desperate attack. And it was a last desperate attack. They couldn't do anything significant for a long time after that, except Little Tet, which was actually a phase of the Tet Offensive. But yeah, they set that up thinking they just needed to have this way to resurrect public opinion, and it did raise public opinion. Unfortunately, it also gave the press a really good storyline, which was, you said we're winning, now we're losing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
A lot of the misinformation that you went over in the beginning of this is known for a long time. That books published 35, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, has those lessons in it. Is your book then a kind of does it address what we think of as kind of public ignorance about the Vietnam War that manifests itself in popular culture, either in think of films, Hollywood films or TV shows or popular songs?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, some of the information was new based on interviews I did. Some of it were older things that I brought forward that I thought had been ignored or underemphasized. But the main thing, the book came out in 2010, was to apply the model to our contemporary unconventional wars. Because what really got me annoyed when I started doing this was seeing the Tet Offensive referred to all over the place, like those headlines, and no one was getting it right. So it was like every reporter who thought he knew something was slipping Tet in, but it was that model that I was trying to attack, what I called analytical autopilot. Like you just throw Tet in there and you've got an instant storyline if you're a reporter. And I write a lot of journalism, so I know how important a storyline is. And that particular storyline was being misapplied all over the place, and it just bugged me. So really, in a way, the book is kind of an answer to that. It was aimed at people who misuse that.
Yeah, I always think of Tet's kind of funny in a way because it's a small palindromic word that is it's a crossword puzzle answer, and because it's so in some ways misunderstood, it's easily applied to everything in all of those examples that you put there.
Oh yeah, I saw something that's like a car bomb went off in Kabul, and immediately. It was like, oh, this is the Tet Offensive. Really, one car bomb? Because there were 80,000 troops in Tet. So how does one suicide bomber equal Tet? I don't. And you don't see it as much now because we have fewer people in contact with the enemy, but for a while there it was just omnipresent. I had one example in the book from, some New York Times writer. Anyway, he said, oh, this is Tet, and like everything's going to get worse. And so I was looking at, actually, it was during the surge, and the casualties were going down, down, down. He said, the next 3 months will be like 5 times worse. It was actually like 10 times better. It's like, but he doesn't have to go revisit his column, and write a retraction or, I was completely wrong. He just moves on to the next column. Well, that's why I have to put him in my book and say you were wrong.
Okay.
Are we good?
Just about 1:15.
Awesome.
So